The plate was empty before Gilbert Trask even sat down. He had carried it across the dusty street from Me's boarding house with both hands, careful not to spill a single drop of the brown gravy that pooled around the thick slice of salt pork, careful not to let the boiled potatoes roll off the edge, careful because it was his supper, and he had not eaten since dawn, and his stomach was a hollow, aching cave. He had worked 14 hours that day. He had ridden 12 miles in the blazing August heat of 1883 to drag a horse thief back to the jail in Caldwell, Kansas, and he had done it without complaint, without reward beyond his deputy's wage, and now all he wanted in the world was to sit down at the small table in his quarters at the back of the sheriff's office and eat his supper in peace. Then he saw them, 2 children on the steps of the mercantile across the street. A boy, perhaps 6 years old, and a girl who could not have been older than 4. They were sitting so close together they looked like one small, huddled shape. The boy had his arm around his sister. The girl was crying without making any sound, her face turned into her brother's shoulder, her small fists balled in the fabric of his shirt. They were thin, not the ordinary thin of frontier children who ran and played and burned every calorie the land gave them. They were the thin of hunger, real hunger, the kind that carved the softness out of a child's face and left something ancient and afraid behind the eyes. Gilbert stopped walking. The plate of food in his hands felt suddenly very heavy. He looked down at the salt pork, the potatoes, the gravy going cool in the evening air. He looked back at the children. The boy looked up and met his eyes, and what Gilbert saw in that small, dirt-streaked face shattered something inside him that he had kept carefully intact for 3 years, ever since he had stopped letting himself feel things too deeply, ever since Clara had left and taken whatever softness he'd had with her. He crossed the street. He crouched down in front of the children and held out the plate, and the boy stared at it for 1 full second before his discipline crumbled and he reached for it with both hands, and Gilbert had to help him hold it steady, and the girl lifted her face from her brother's shoulder and looked at the food with eyes so wide and so desperate that Gilbert had to look away because he did not want them to see what it did to him. "Go on," he said quietly. "It is yours." He stood up and he put his hands in his pockets and he stared down the empty main street of Caldwell, and he told himself he was not hungry, even though his stomach was screaming at him that he was a liar. That was when the door of the mercantile opened behind him and a woman stepped out, and even before he turned around, Gilbert heard the sound of her voice, low and strained with the specific terror of a mother who has looked away from her children for 30 seconds too long and found them gone. "Eli, Clara, me." The voice broke on the second name. "Eli, I told you to wait inside. I told you to stay right where I could see you." Gilbert turned. He had lived in Caldwell for 3 years. He knew almost everyone in town by name, by sight, by the particular way they walked down the main street or tied their horse at the rail outside the saloon. He did not know this woman. She was tall for a woman, with dark hair that had mostly escaped whatever pins she had used to put it up, falling in loose strands around a face that was sharp with exhaustion and worry and something else, something harder to name, something like pride being slowly, painfully dismantled by circumstance. She was wearing a dress that had been mended so many times in so many places that the mending had become the dress, and her boots had split along the left seam and been stitched back together with what looked like leather cord. She was beautiful in the way that difficult things are beautiful, the way a hawk is beautiful when it is fighting the wind, all fierce concentration and refusal to fall. She looked at her children. She looked at the plate of food. She looked at Gilbert. And then, because she was a proud woman and pride was the last thing she had left, her face went very still and she said, "Those are my children." "Yes, ma'am," Gilbert said. "I believe they are. That is your supper." He looked at the boy Eli, who was feeding a piece of potato to his little sister with such careful gravity that Gilbert's chest tightened again. "It was," he said. He watched the war play out across her face. The pride that wanted her to take the plate away and give it back to him. The love for her children that would not let her do it. the shame that came from being seen in a moment when you had nothing left to give the people who needed you most. He recognized every single one of those feelings because he had worn them himself, and it was that recognition that made him look away again to give her the privacy of the moment. "I am Maggie Ramsey," she said finally. Her voice was steady now, controlled, armored. "I do not accept charity." "It is not charity," Gilbert said. "A man gets full before he finishes his supper sometimes." She looked at the empty plate that her children were cleaning with their fingers. That plate is not half-eaten, deputy, so she had noticed his badge. He touched it reflexively. "Gilbert Trask," he said, "and you are right, it is charity. I apologize for the word game. But your children are hungry, Mrs. Ramsey, and my supper is already gone, so there does not seem to be much point in arguing about it." That was how it started. That was the moment that opened everything that came after. All the secrets and the danger and the love that neither of them had been looking for, and neither of them knew how to refuse. Maggie Ramsey had arrived in Caldwell, Kansas, 6 days before that evening in August of 1883, on a stagecoach from Wichita that had broken an axle 30 miles outside of town and limped the rest of the distance on 3 wheels and a prayer. She had arrived with 2 children, a single trunk that contained everything she owned, and $43, which was not enough to pay the first month's rent on any habitable space in town, feed herself and her children, and also find work before the money ran out entirely. She had left Wichita because she had no choice. She had been there for 8 months after leaving her husband's farm in Missouri. 8 months of trying to make a life in a city that did not particularly want her. 8 months of working as a seamstress for 12 hours a day, and still coming up short every single week. Caldwell had been the suggestion of a woman at the boarding house in Wichita. A kind-faced woman named Ruth who had said that her cousin ran a dry goods store in Caldwell and needed someone with a good hand and a reliable nature, and that the town was growing, and that a woman who was willing to work would find work there. Ruth had not mentioned that her cousin had sold the dry goods store 2 months earlier and moved to Denver. That detail had revealed itself to Maggie on her first morning in Caldwell, when she had gone to the address Ruth had given her and found a hardware supply business where the dry goods store had been, run by a short, unfriendly man named Grover who had no interest in hiring a seamstress and even less interest in her story. So Maggie had done what she always did when the world knocked her down. She had picked herself up, dusted herself off, set her jaw, and started walking up and down the main street of Caldwell, Kansas, looking for work. She had found a little. Mrs. Aldrich at the boarding house had given her a room in exchange for help with the laundry and mending, which covered the roof over their heads but left them dependent on what little cash Maggie could earn from other sources. A rancher's wife had paid her $2 to alter a Sunday dress. The wife of the bank manager had given her 50 cents for darning. It was not enough. It was nowhere near enough. On the 6th day, the day she met Gilbert Trask, Maggie had been in the mercantile asking Mr. Hollies, the proprietor, whether he needed any help, and she had told Eli and Clara me to wait by the door, and she had turned around for 10 minutes to have a quiet, controlled, desperately hopeful conversation with Mr. Hollies, who had been kind enough in his refusal but definitive, and when she had turned back around her children were gone, and her heart had stopped entirely. She had found them on the steps. She had found them being fed her deputy's supper. That night, after the children were asleep on the narrow bed they shared in the small room at Mrs. Aldrich's boarding house, Maggie sat in the single chair by the window and thought about Gilbert Trask. She thought about the way he had crouched down in front of her children without any hesitation, without any calculation, without any of the careful social arithmetic that most people performed before doing something kind. She thought about the way he had looked away when he saw her struggling, giving her space to feel what she needed to feel without the added weight of being watched feeling it. She thought about the look on his face when her children reached for the food. Not pity exactly. Something more complicated. Something that looked, from a certain angle, very much like grief. She also thought about his face. She was not proud of that, but she was honest enough with herself to admit it. He was not a handsome man in the conventional magazine illustration sense. He was lean and weathered, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same hard, reddish stone that cropped up along the Chicaskia River, and dark eyes under heavy brows that had the quality of still water, deep and opaque, and impossible to read at first glance. His hands were large and capable and careful. He had carried that plate of food across the street, with the focused attention of a man who understood that the things he carried mattered. She told herself firmly that she had no business thinking about a deputy's face or his hands or the way he carried things. She had 2 children and $41 and no prospects, and the last time she had let herself think about a man's face it had ended in a farmhouse in Missouri, where the winters were so cold the water in the wash basin froze by morning, and her husband, Thomas Ramsey, had been a decent man who had worked himself to death and left her with nothing but love and debt in roughly equal measure. Thomas had been gone for 14 months. She still missed him with the specific ache of missing someone who had been genuinely good, genuinely kind, genuinely trying. He had not been dramatic or exciting. He had been steady, and in her experience steadiness was the rarest and most valuable quality a person could have, and she had not known how much she depended on his particular brand of quiet reliability until it was gone. She was not looking for a replacement. She was not looking for anything except survival for herself and her children. She went to sleep telling herself that. Gilbert Trask went to bed hungry that night, and he did not regret it for a single moment. He lay on his cot in the back room of the sheriff's office and stared at the ceiling and thought about Maggie Ramsey's face when she had said that plate is not half-eaten, deputy, and the way her voice had been absolutely steady even though everything underneath it was not. He thought about the boy Eli who had fed his sister before himself, 6 years old and already carrying the weight of it. He thought about the girl with the silent tears and the balled-up fists. He had given up his supper. It was a small thing. It cost him nothing except the hunger, and hunger he could manage. What cost him more was the feeling that he could not shake as he lay there in the dark, the feeling that he had been walking through Caldwell for 3 years like a man moving through a landscape that did not quite require him to be fully present in it, doing his job, keeping the peace, being reliable and competent and utterly, fundamentally alone, and that giving a plate of food to 2 hungry children had cracked something open in him that he was not sure he could close again. He thought about Maggie Ramsey's eyes. Dark brown, almost black, with the kind of directness that made looking away feel like the more comfortable option. She had looked at him, and she had seen exactly what was happening, and she had not pretended otherwise, and there was something in that bare, unflinching honesty that he found more dangerous than anything else about her. He had been in Caldwell for 3 years, as he said, and in those 3 years he had been a good deputy. Sheriff Cole Harrington trusted him completely, which was not something Harrington offered easily. He had ridden down outlaws and broken up fights at the Long Branch Saloon and delivered bad news to people who needed it delivered gently, and his reputation in the county was solid, dependable, unexciting. He was 29 years old, and he was already the kind of man that people described as steady, and he was only now beginning to understand that steady could be another word for frozen. Clara had left in the spring of 1880. She had been a woman from a good family in Abilene, who had found the reality of a deputy's life in a cattle town much less appealing than the romance of it, and she had told him so in a letter that he had read 3 times before he understood what it meant. She had not been cruel about it. She had been honest and precise, and she had returned his ring by post, and he had put the ring in a tin box in the bottom of his trunk, and he had not taken it out since. He had decided, quietly and without drama, that he was not built for the kind of love that required a person to make themselves vulnerable. He was built for duty. He was good at duty. Duty did not leave. Maggie Ramsey, he told himself firmly, was a woman in difficult circumstances who needed practical help, not a broken deputy's complicated feelings. He went to sleep telling himself that. The next morning, Gilbert was making his rounds when he saw Maggie coming out of the laundress's house on the south end of town, carrying a basket of wet linen that was clearly too heavy for her. She was managing it with the grim determination of a woman who refused to ask for help, her jaw set and her back slightly bent under the weight, and without thinking about it, Gilbert crossed the street and took the other handle of the basket. She stopped walking immediately. "Deputy Trask," she said. "Mrs. Ramsey," he said. "I am going south. Which way is yours?" She looked at him for a long moment, doing that assessment thing she did where her eyes moved over a situation with quick, precise intelligence and came to a conclusion. "The boarding house," she said. "Mrs. Aldrich's." "Then we are going the same direction," he said, and started walking. After a moment, she walked beside him. They were quiet for the first half of the block. The street was busy, the morning traffic of a cattle town in full swing, drovers and merchants, and the occasional flash of color from the saloon girls leaning out of upper windows to watch the world go by. Caldwell in August of 1883 was a town at a specific, precarious moment in its history. The cattle trade still flowing, but the sense in the air that things were changing, that the drives from Texas would not go on forever, that the wild years were ending and something more settled and harder to name was coming to replace them. "You do not have to do this," Maggie said. "I know," he said. "I am not a charity case." "You told me that last night," he said. "I remember." She glanced at him sideways and he caught the look from the corner of his own eye weighing him. "Then why are you carrying my laundry?" "Because it is heavy and you are carrying it by yourself," he said. "Those are the only reasons." Another silence, but a different kind, less hostile. "Where are your children this morning?" he asked. "Eli is at the boarding house with Clara me. Mrs. Aldrich is watching them. She is a kind woman." A pause. "She does not charge me for the room in exchange for the mending and laundry work." "She is a fair woman," Gilbert agreed. "She has been in Caldwell since before the railroad came. Her husband built that boarding house with his own hands." "She told me," Maggie said. "She talks about him like he just stepped out for a moment. He has been gone 8 years. She was quiet for a moment. "That kind of love does not diminish," she said, and there was something in her voice that made him understand she was not speaking entirely in the abstract. "No," he said, "it does not." They reached the boarding house. Gilbert set down his side of the basket and she set down hers, and she straightened up and looked at him with those direct, dark eyes. "Thank you," she said. It cost her something, he could see that. She was not a woman who found receiving graceful or easy. "You are welcome," he said. "Do you have work lined up for today?" The question was forward and he knew it, but the practical circumstances seemed to override the social rules. She seemed to accept this. "I am going to speak to the dressmaker on the far end of Main Street," she said. "Mrs. Perkins, I have heard she is sometimes in need of an extra pair of hands." "She is," Gilbert said. "Her apprentice left in June to get married. She has been struggling since." He paused. "Tell her Cole Harrington's deputy sent you. She and the sheriff have an understanding." Maggie looked at him, and for the first time something shifted in her expression, something loosened just slightly. Not gratitude exactly, or not only gratitude. Something more like recognition, the recognition of one careful person seeing care in another. "I will do that," she said. She went inside. He stood on the street for a moment, looking at the door she had closed behind her, and then he put his hat back on and walked back toward the sheriff's office and told himself that he had done nothing except carry a basket and offer a practical suggestion. Nothing that required any further thought. He thought about it for the rest of the day. Mrs. Perkins did take Maggie on, as it turned out. Not a full arrangement at first, only piecework, 2 days a week to begin with. But it was regular income, and it was work that Maggie was genuinely skilled at, which mattered because Mrs. Perkins was a precise, exacting woman who did not suffer incompetence. She had trained under a dressmaker in St. Louis before coming west with her husband, and she had standards that a lot of women in Caldwell found intimidating, and she found in Maggie a woman who not only met those standards but occasionally exceeded them. By the end of the first week, she had offered Maggie 3 days. By the end of the second week, 4. The income was not substantial, but it was growing, and Maggie began, for the first time since she had stepped off that broken-axled stagecoach, to feel something other than the low, grinding panic of a woman one bad week away from disaster. It was during the second week, on a Wednesday afternoon, that Eli came home from playing near the creek with 2 other boys his age, and arrived at the boarding house with a split lip and a black eye forming, and the kind of bright, furious, devastated expression that a 6-year-old wears when he has discovered that the world is capable of cruelty, and has not yet developed enough armor to bear it without showing. Maggie sat him down and cleaned his face with water from the basin and asked him quietly and directly what had happened, and Eli, who was his mother's son and therefore constitutionally unable to be indirect about anything, told her that 2 older boys had said his mother was a beggar woman who lived on charity and that his dead father had left them with nothing because he was a failure. Maggie was very still for a moment. Then she said, calmly and clearly, "Your father was not a failure. Your father worked harder than anyone I have ever known, and he loved us better than most people are loved in a lifetime." The boys who said that are repeating words they heard from grown people who are scared of things they do not understand, and that is the whole truth of it. Eli nodded. His chin was trembling. "I hit the big one," he said, with a complicated combination of shame and satisfaction. "I know," Maggie said. "I can see it on your knuckles. We will talk about that. But first." She pulled him into her arms and held him, and he let himself cry for exactly 30 seconds, before pulling back and wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, in the determined way of a boy who has decided that crying is acceptable, but has a strict time limit on it. Gilbert heard about the incident from the sheriff the next morning. Harrington had a way of knowing everything that happened in Caldwell within 12 hours of its happening, a talent that made him an excellent lawman and occasionally an unsettling dinner companion. "Widow Ramsey's boy had a fight," Harrington said, not looking up from the papers on his desk. "Parker boy and his friend. She dealt with it herself. Did not come to me." "Good," Gilbert said, and then caught himself, because the warmth in the word was visible and Harrington was an observant man. Harrington looked up. He was 52 years old, with a silver mustache and the patient, steady eyes of a man who had been watching human nature for a long time and had arrived at a settled understanding of it. "She is a good woman," he said, "from what I have seen." "She is," Gilbert said, keeping his voice neutral. Harrington went back to his papers. "A man could do worse," he said, apparently to the papers. Gilbert put on his hat and went out to make his rounds. He told himself that Harrington was a meddlesome old man, and that whatever Gilbert felt about Maggie Ramsey was professional courtesy and nothing more. He went to Me's that evening and ordered 2 suppers. He told himself it was because he was particularly hungry that night, after a long day. He carried one of the plates across to the boarding house and knocked on the door, and Mrs. Aldrich answered and looked at the plate and looked at him, and smiled the particular smile of a woman who has seen this kind of thing before and finds it endlessly charming. She went to get Maggie. Maggie came to the door with flour on her hands, apparently having been helping Mrs. Aldrich with the evening baking. She looked at the plate, she looked at him. "I ordered too much," he said. "Did you?" she said. "It happens," he said. "The portions at Me's are unreliable." A pause. The corner of her mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was the outline of one, the suggestion that a smile was possible, that the architecture for it existed and was merely waiting for the right structural support. "You ordered 2 suppers," she said. "I was very hungry," he said, the almost smile. "Deputy Trask, Mrs. Ramsey, I will not make a habit of accepting food from you," she said, "but my children had a difficult day and I think a good supper might be welcome." "That is all I thought," he said. She took the plate. Her fingers brushed his briefly in the transfer, just the lightest contact, and they both looked away at the same moment with the synchronized composure of 2 people who are pretending that a small, electric thing did not just happen. "Good evening," she said. "Good evening," he said. He walked back to the sheriff's office eating his own supper and told himself he was a man of some experience and control, and that the warmth spreading through him was only the food. The dark past found its way into the open on a Thursday evening at the end of August, when Maggie was walking back from Mrs. Perkins' shop at dusk, and a man stepped out of the alley beside the saddle repair shop and said her name. She stopped. She knew the voice. She had been afraid in some deep and animal part of herself that she might hear it someday, somewhere, ever since she had left Missouri. His name was Frank Culver, and he had been a business partner of Thomas Ramsey's. Or rather, he had been the man Thomas had borrowed money from in the last desperate year before the harvest failed. And when Thomas died, Frank Culver had arrived at the farm within 2 weeks to explain that the loan had carried terms that Maggie had not been told about. Terms that made her responsible for repaying not only the principal but an interest rate that would have taken her 20 years to clear. She had left. She had taken her children and what she could carry, and she had left Missouri before Frank Culver could establish any legal claim over the farm or over her. And she had been running from the possibility of him ever since, telling herself that a man like Culver did not chase a widow across the country for a debt of $400 when there were easier ways to make money. She had been wrong about that. Mrs. Ramsey, Frank Culver said. He was a broad, solid man with a face like the side of a barn and small, calculating eyes that had always reminded her of a man taking stock of livestock. "I have been looking for you, Mr. Culver," she said. Her voice was completely steady. She was proud of that. "I think you have wasted a journey." "I do not think so," he said. "You still owe me money, Mrs. Ramsey. With interest the figure now stands at—" "The figure is a fabrication," she said. "Thomas borrowed $200 from you. He paid back 140 of it before he died. The interest rate you quoted me was not agreed to in writing and would not stand up in any legitimate court of law." Culver smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. "There are courts and there are courts," he said. "And there are ways of making a woman understand her situation that do not require a courtroom." Maggie felt the threat land, felt the cold of it move through her, and she kept her face absolutely still and her voice absolutely level and said, "I think you should leave Caldwell, Mr. Culver." "I think you should pay what you owe," he said. She walked away. She walked with her back straight and her head up, and she did not look back, and she did not start shaking until she was inside the boarding house with the door closed behind her, and even then she only let herself shake for a moment before she stopped. She did not tell Gilbert. She told herself there was nothing to tell. Culver was a bully and a schemer, but she did not have evidence of a crime, only a threatening implication, and she had handled men like Culver before. She had the resources of her own sharp mind and her own determined spine, and she did not need a deputy to fight her battles for her. She went to bed that night and listened to her children breathe in the dark and thought carefully and methodically about her options, which was what she always did when she was afraid. Gilbert knew something was wrong the next morning. He could not have explained precisely how he knew, only that he had learned to read Maggie Ramsey in the 3 weeks since he had given her his supper, had learned the particular way she held her shoulders when she was managing something difficult, the extra degree of control in her face that appeared when she was working hard to show less than she felt. He saw those signs as she crossed the street toward Mrs. Perkins' shop, and he was across the street and beside her before he had fully decided to do it. "What happened?" he said. She looked at him. "The assessment, the quick calculation. Nothing that concerns the law," she said. "What happened?" he said again without any change in tone. She stopped walking. For a moment she looked not angry or guarded but simply tired, exhausted with the effort of carrying everything alone, and it was that look more than anything else that made him want to stand between her and whatever it was until the end of the world. She told him about Frank Culver. He listened without interrupting, which she noticed because most men did not. He asked 2 questions when she was done, both of them practical. How long had Culver been in town and where was he staying? She did not know the answer to the second, and she told him so. "I will find out," he said. "Gilbert." It was the first time she had used his given name, and they both noticed it, a small shift in the air between them. "I'm not asking you to fight my battles. "I know," he said. "I am going to find out where he is staying, and I am going to make sure he understands the law clearly, because what he said to you last night is the beginning of intimidation, and I am the law in this town. That is not fighting your battle. That is my job." She looked at him for a long, quiet moment. The morning sun was full on his face, and she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the ones that came from squinting into bright distances, and the line of his jaw, and the steadiness that lived in him like a kind of bedrock. "All right," she said. Gilbert found Frank Culver at the Grand Hotel, which was the only establishment in Caldwell with the word grand in its name, and was about as grand as a wooden box with curtains. He had a room on the second floor, and he had been in town for 4 days, which told Gilbert that he had arrived before the threatening conversation in the alley, which meant he had been watching Maggie before he spoke to her. He did not like that at all. He knocked on the door and showed his badge when Culver answered and said, pleasantly and with complete clarity, that he was aware of Mr. Culver's presence in Caldwell and the nature of his business with Mrs. Ramsey, and that anything that could be construed as harassment or intimidation of any woman or any family in his jurisdiction would result in immediate arrest, and that furthermore the claim Culver was pressing was legally dubious at best, and Gilbert would personally assist Mrs. Ramsey in finding legal representation if Culver chose to pursue it through legitimate channels. Culver looked at him with those livestock-appraising eyes and said that he had come a long way for what he was owed. Gilbert said he had heard that, and that the law was not in the habit of being sympathetic to creditors who used dark alleys and implied threats to conduct their business. He left. He did not put his hand on his gun. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. When he found Maggie that evening and told her what he had done, she was quiet for so long that he began to wonder if he had overstepped. Then she said, "Why do you do this?" He thought about it. He owed her honesty. "Because you and your children are the most alive people I have encountered in 3 years," he said. "And I have been asleep for 3 years, and I am not sure I want to go back to sleep." She looked at him, and something in her face changed, genuinely changed, the last of the careful armor shifting. "Thomas died 14 months ago," she said. "I am not looking for a replacement for him." "I know," he said. "I am not trying to be one." "Then what are you trying to be?" She asked, and it was not a hostile question but a real one, asked by a woman who thought in precise, direct terms and needed precise, direct answers. He thought about it honestly. "A friend to begin with," he said. "And then whatever comes after that, if anything does, at whatever pace you can manage." She looked at him for a long, searching moment. The vulnerability in her face was something she was allowing him to see. He understood, not something she had let slip accidentally. It was a deliberate offering of trust from a woman who did not offer it easily or often. "I can manage a friend," she said. Frank Culver left Caldwell 2 days later. He checked out of the Grand Hotel on a Sunday morning and rode north toward Wichita, and Gilbert watched him go from the window of the sheriff's office with the specific satisfaction of a man who has removed a threat without firing a shot. He told Maggie that evening and watched the relief move through her, visible for just a moment before she contained it. "He may come back," she said. "He may," Gilbert agreed. "But it will be harder for him each time, and eventually the trouble will cost more than whatever he thinks he can get, and he will stop." "You sound very certain." "I have seen a lot of men like him," he said. "They are built for easy prey. The moment the prey turns and faces them, they recalculate." She was quiet. "Then I should not have run from Missouri. I should have turned and faced him then." "You had 2 children under 6 and no money and no support," Gilbert said. "Running was not cowardice. It was the only available strategy at the time." She looked at him. "You are very good at making people feel less ashamed of their survival," she said. "I have been ashamed of mine more than once," he said. "I know what it feels like." That opened something, a door he had not meant to open, and he saw her notice it, and her expression shifted into the careful, attentive patience of a woman who is listening and will wait as long as it takes. He told her about Clara. "Not all of it, Not the whole detailed map of the disappointment and the long, quiet damage it had done, but enough. Enough for her to understand why he had been living half-awake for 3 years, doing his duty and nothing else. He told it simply, without self-pity or drama, because that was how he told things, and she listened without looking away and without offering the false comfort of premature reassurance. When he was done, she said, "She was afraid of the life, not of you." "I know," he said. "It took me 2 years to separate those things." "Did it hurt less after that?" "It became different," he said. "Not less exactly, more like a scar. It is still there, but you stop reaching for the wound." She nodded slowly. "Thomas has been a wound for 14 months, she said. "I am waiting for it to become a scar," a pause. "I loved him very much." "I know," he said. "I can see it in your children. They are loved people, both of them." That broke something in her, some last held thing, and she pressed her hand briefly over her mouth and looked away, and he let her, gave her the privacy he understood she needed, looked out the window at the last orange light dying over the rooftops of Caldwell. After a moment she said, quietly, "Thank you." "For what?" "For seeing them," she said. "For seeing us." A lot of people look at a widow with 2 children and a mended dress, and they see a problem or a charity case or an inconvenience. You looked at us and you saw people. He thought about the night on the mercantile steps, the boy feeding his sister. "I saw a boy doing the best he could," he said. "I have a great deal of respect for that." She smiled, and it was the first time he had seen her smile fully and without reservation, and it transformed her face in the way that a door opening onto a sunlit room transforms the quality of light, sudden and generous and warm. He had not been prepared for how much it would affect him. He went home that night in a completely different condition than the man who had been lying on his cot wondering if he was capable of feeling anything. Something had been unlocked. The weeks that followed were a slow, careful, entirely deliberate accumulation of ordinary moments, the kind that do not look like much from the outside, but constitute the real architecture of love when you are honest about what is actually being built. He fixed the split in her boot when she set it outside her door for cobbling, and he happened to notice it before the cobbler's boy picked it up. And he repaired it himself, because he had the tools and the skill from a winter in his early 20s, spent learning the trade out of boredom and necessity. She did not mention it directly, but she made him a set of shirt buttons to replace the mismatched ones on his good shirt, and he wore the shirt the next Sunday, and she noticed. And he saw her notice, and neither of them said anything, and both of them understood everything. He played checkers with Eli on Sunday afternoons, sitting on the boarding house porch while Clara Me colored in an old sketchbook Maggie had found at the dry goods store. Eli was a ferociously competitive checkers player with the same direct, honest intelligence as his mother, and he did not appreciate being let win, which Gilbert appreciated about him. Gilbert played to win, and Eli played to win, and they were evenly matched in a way that surprised and delighted both of them. Clara Me, who was now 4.5 and had the kind of absolute, categorical certainty about her own preferences that only very small children and very old people possess, decided within the first 2 Sundays that Gilbert Trask was a satisfactory human being, a judgment she conveyed by climbing into his lap without any preamble during the 3rd Sunday and going to sleep there. And the expression on Gilbert's face when this happened was something that Maggie filed away in the part of herself where she kept the things that mattered. She was falling in love with him. She recognized the feeling with a certain amount of alarm and a great deal of wonder, because she had not expected to feel it again, had not been sure she wanted to, had built a reasonably solid argument for why she should not. The argument fell apart every time he looked at her with those deep, still eyes, every time he said something quietly funny that was so dry it took her a second to catch it, and then made her laugh with genuine, unguarded delight, every time she watched him with her children and saw the particular quality of attention he gave them, which was the attention of a man who took them seriously. The kiss came on the 14th of September, A Thursday evening, on the back porch of the boarding house, while the first real edge of autumn was in the air, and the sky was that particular deep, uninterrupted blue that happened in Kansas in the early fall before the clouds came back. They had been talking for an hour, leaning against the porch rail with the easy, loose comfort of people who have moved past the careful stage into something more genuine. And there was a pause in the conversation, and in the pause they looked at each other, and Gilbert said, "Maggie," and she said, "Yes," and he leaned forward and kissed her very gently. It was not a long kiss. It was the kind of kiss that asks a question more than it states a fact, and she answered it by not pulling back. And when they separated, she put her hand briefly on his cheek, and they looked at each other in the deep blue evening, and both of them were entirely, precisely aware that something irrevocable had just happened. "I am not going to apologize for that," he said. "I am glad," she said. "I am also not going to rush anything," he said. "You have enough to manage without Gilbert," she said. "Stop telling me what I need," he blinked. "Then fair enough. I will tell you what I need," she said, "when I know what it is." "That seems reasonable," he said. She smiled that full, transforming smile. "Good." He went home that night in a state of such complete, transparent happiness that Sheriff Harrington took one look at him the next morning and said, without looking up from his papers, "About time," and Gilbert put on his hat and went to make his rounds with the dignity of a man who refused to be rattled. October brought the first serious cold, and a development that complicated everything. A man named Dale Covington arrived in Caldwell from Texas with a crew of 8 men, and a reputation for violence that preceded him like weather. He was a cattle baron in the middle of a very specific kind of legal trouble, the kind that involved land that was not legally his, and a deed of title that had been acquired through means that several parties in Comanche County were prepared to dispute. He had come north ahead of the dispute, which was a polite way of saying he had left ahead of a posse, and he arrived in Caldwell with the confidence of a man who believed that northern Kansas was far enough from his problems to render them temporarily irrelevant. It was not. The posse from Comanche County arrived 2 days later, which put Gilbert and Sheriff Harrington in the middle of a jurisdictional dispute that was genuinely complex and potentially explosive. Covington's men were armed and hostile, and inclined to interpret any legal process as an attack. The Comanche County men were legitimate law with legitimate papers, but they were in Caldwell's jurisdiction, and Harrington had to manage both sides without anyone getting shot. The situation was tense, and it required most of Gilbert's time and attention for 5 days, which meant he saw Maggie only in passing, which felt like deprivation in a way he had not expected, a specific, aching absence that made him realize precisely how much he had begun to depend on her presence. On the 4th day, Covington's segundo, a dangerous man named Yates who had the tight-coiled quality of a spring under too much pressure, saw Gilbert talking to Maggie on the street and made a remark about a deputy who kept a widow for comfort that was designed to be overheard and was. Gilbert heard it. Maggie heard it. Yates was watching to see what would happen. Gilbert looked at Maggie for exactly 1 second, and what he read in her face was not embarrassment or fear but a cold, clear fury, and he turned back to Yates and said, without any particular change of temperature, "If you say anything like that again, I will arrest you for disturbing the peace so fast you will not have time to spit." Yates smiled. "On what charge exactly, deputy?" "I am creative," Gilbert said. "Test me." Yates did not test him. He walked away, and Gilbert turned back to Maggie and said quietly, "I apologize. You should not have had to hear that." "You said nothing wrong," she said. Her voice was very controlled. "I have been called worse things." "That does not make it acceptable," he said. She looked at him carefully. "You are going to have to be careful with Covington's men," she said. "They are looking for reasons." "I know," he said. "Stay inside when you can over the next day or two. I am going to resolve this today." She looked at him with the expression she had when she was worried and was refusing to show it. "Be careful," she said. The Covington situation resolved the next day when Harrington and Gilbert, working together with the precision of two men who had spent years learning each other's instincts, managed to separate Covington from his crew long enough to present the Comanche County papers in a context that was legally airtight and practically difficult to argue with. Covington was a dangerous man, but he was not a stupid one, and after a long, silent consideration, he agreed to return south voluntarily to face the dispute through legitimate channels, on the condition that his men were given safe passage out of town. It was the kind of resolution that looked, from the outside, like almost nothing. From the inside, it was a masterpiece of controlled tension and precise execution, and when it was done, Harrington lit a pipe on the porch of the sheriff's office and said, with the deep satisfaction of a man who has herded a dangerous bull out of a china shop without breaking a single cup, "Good work, Gil." Gilbert found Maggie that evening at the boarding house porch and sat down beside her in the cool October air and was quiet for a long moment. "It is over," he said. She let out a breath. "I know. Mrs. Aldrich told me Covington and his men rode out an hour ago." A pause. "I was worried," he looked at her. "About the situation. About you," she said. Simply, directly, in the way she said everything. He took her hand, there on the porch in the early dark, and she did not pull it back, and they sat quietly for a while in the way of two people who have stopped needing to fill all the silence. November came with hard frost and the end of the cattle season, and a quieter, slower version of Caldwell that suited the new shape of things better than the roaring August version had. The main street was less crowded. The Long Branch was less loud. There was a quality of settling, of the world drawing inward and becoming more intimate, that matched exactly the direction that Maggie and Gilbert were moving in. He asked her, on a cold Sunday afternoon with the last leaves coming off the cottonwoods along the creek, whether she would be willing to have supper with him at Mee's, properly, at a table, the two of them, which was the Caldwell equivalent of a very formal declaration. She said yes, with that full smile that still stopped the air in his chest. They had supper at Mee's, and Mrs. Mee, who knew everything, gave them the table by the window and brought out the lamb stew that she only made for special occasions, and the evening was as warm and ordinary and extraordinary as such evenings can be, full of talk and laughter and the specific tenderness that comes from two people who have chosen each other with full knowledge of what they are both bringing to the arrangement. He walked her back to the boarding house afterward. On the porch, in the cold, he took both her hands. "I have something I want to say," he said. "Say it," she said. "I love you," he said, not in a way that requires any immediate response or any pressure. "But I have been not saying it for about 6 weeks, and it is getting increasingly difficult to maintain." She looked at him for a long moment, and he could see her, the real her, without any armor or management, just Maggie, clear-eyed and brave and achingly honest. "I love you too," she said. "It surprised me. I was not expecting to, but there it is." He leaned forward and kissed her, and this time it was not a question. When he pulled back, she was laughing softly, a low, warm sound, and he thought in a completely clear and undefended way that he had never heard anything he wanted to hear more for the rest of his life. December brought Christmas, and with it a conversation that had been approaching for weeks with the inevitability of weather. Eli, who was 6 and direct in the way only children can be, asked Gilbert one Sunday afternoon while they were playing checkers on the porch, now bundled in coats because of the cold, whether he was going to marry his mother. Gilbert considered this question with the seriousness it deserved. "That is between your mother and me," he said. "Are you going to ask her?" Eli said. "I am thinking about it," Gilbert said. Eli moved a checker. "You should ask her," he said. "She smiles more now." Gilbert looked at the boy, this 6-year-old who had fed his sister before himself on the mercantile steps, who played checkers like a general and worried about his mother with the fierce, tender protectiveness of a much older person. "Does she?" he said. "Yes," Eli said. "Before she only smiled at us. Now she smiles at other things too." A pause. "She smiled at the horses this morning. She never used to smile at horses." Gilbert lost the checkers game spectacularly because he was thinking about Maggie Ramsey smiling at horses. He proposed on Christmas Eve. He did it simply and privately in Mrs. Aldrich's parlor after the children were asleep, with a ring that he had ordered from a jewelry house in Wichita 3 weeks earlier. It was a plain silver band with a small blue stone, modest and not ostentatious, which was right for the both of them. He told her that he knew she was still finding her footing, that he knew she was not a woman who needed saving, that what he was offering was not rescue but partnership, a life built together with equal say and equal standing, room for her work and her children, and her particular fierce way of being in the world. He told her that he had been asleep for 3 years before she walked into his life, and that he had no intention of going back to sleep. She looked at the ring in his hand for a long moment, and he waited. "Yes," she said. "Gilbert Trask, yes." He put the ring on her finger, and she put her arms around him, and he held her in the quiet parlor, while the December wind moved outside, and somewhere in the town a church bell rang the hour, and he was the most completely present he had ever been in his life. They were married on the 15th of February, 1884, in the small Methodist church on Cedar Street, the one with the stained glass window above the door that scattered blue and amber light across the floor when the afternoon sun hit it at the right angle. Sheriff Harrington was the best man. Mrs. Perkins made Maggie's dress, a deep blue wool that matched the stone in her ring, and it was the most beautiful dress in Caldwell by such a wide margin that even the women who were inclined to be competitive about such things simply admitted it. Mrs. Aldrich cried happily all through the ceremony. Clara Me fell asleep in the front pew with a flower crown slightly sideways on her head, which was the most perfectly Clara Me thing that had ever happened. Eli sat beside her with the composed gravity of a man who has just seen something important concluded properly. When the Reverend pronounced them married and Gilbert kissed his wife, which he did with a directness and certainty that made Mrs. Aldrich cry harder, the assembled congregation of Caldwell applauded with the wholehearted enthusiasm of a frontier town that appreciated a good story. The spring of 1884 was the best spring Gilbert could remember in years. He had moved Maggie and the children into the small house he had been renting on the east side of Caldwell, a solid little place with 3 rooms and a porch, and a yard where Eli immediately began planning a garden with the same methodical intensity he brought to checkers. Clara Me claimed the largest portion of the yard for her own purposes, which were unclear but passionately held. Maggie continued working for Mrs. Perkins, which she had made clear from the beginning she intended to do. She was not a woman who defined herself entirely through her domestic situation, and Gilbert understood this and respected it completely. He had told her on the night he proposed that he meant equal standing, and he meant it. They settled into each other with the ease of 2 people who have lived alone long enough to know exactly who they are and what they need, which made the accommodation not a grinding of edges but a genuine fitting together. He was a quiet man who needed early mornings alone to think. She was a woman who needed the last hour of the evening without conversation to process the day. They discovered these things about each other in the first week and made room for them without discussion, because they were both people who observed carefully and acted on what they saw. He was a calm, steady presence in the chaos of 2 small children, not because he found chaos easy, but because he understood that calm was a gift you could offer people, and he offered it as consistently as he could. Eli called him Gil within the first week of the new arrangement, and then stopped, visibly uncertain, and Gilbert told him that Gil was perfectly fine, that he liked it, and the relief on Eli's face was something Maggie filed in the same private place where she kept the other things that mattered. Clara Me, with the absolute categorical authority that characterized all her pronouncements, began calling him Papa before any adult had suggested or approved it. On a Tuesday morning in March, when she was trying to get a lid off a jar of preserves and could not manage it, and turned around and said, "Papa, open this, please," and Gilbert took the jar and opened it and handed it back without any acknowledgement of what she had just said. because he was afraid that acknowledging it would somehow cause it to be taken back, and he found that he wanted it very much. That evening he told Maggie, and she listened, and then she kissed him quietly and said, "She chose you," in a voice that was very precise and very full. In the summer of 1884, Maggie told Gilbert that she was expecting their first child, and the look on his face was a thing she would keep for the rest of her life. The way it moved from disbelief to such complete and transparent joy that it was almost difficult to look at directly, like looking into bright light. The baby was born in February of 1885, a boy in the same house on the east side of Caldwell, delivered by the town's physician, Dr. Owens, with Mrs. Aldrich in attendance, and he was healthy and loud, and had Gilbert's dark eyes and Maggie's sharp chin, and a disposition that was immediately apparent as one that intended to engage fully with every aspect of the world it found itself in. They named him Thomas Gilbert Trask, the first name for a man who had been steady and good and who deserved to be remembered, the second for the man who was present and trying to be worthy of the responsibility. Gilbert held his son in the early morning of the birthday and was so quietly overwhelmed that he could not speak for several minutes, and Maggie watched him from the bed, tired and radiant and completely at peace. Eli received the news of a baby brother with the dignified acceptance of a young man who had expected this development and had formed opinions about it. Clara Mee received it with the absolute, non-negotiable announcement that the baby was hers, a position from which she declined to be moved, and which she enforced with a ferocious tenderness that made both her parents laugh until they cried. The summer of 1885 was the summer that everything about Caldwell began to change in ways that were becoming impossible to ignore. The cattle drives from Texas were diminishing. The railroad had changed the routes. The wild, wide-open version of the town that had made names like Caldwell famous throughout the country was quieting, the saloons less raucous, the drifting population of cowboys and outlaws and gamblers thinning out as the economic reason for them disappeared. Sheriff Harrington announced in August that he intended to retire at the end of the year. He was 54 years old and his wife was asking him to stop, and he had decided that she had earned the right to be heard on the matter. He recommended Gilbert to the county commissioners for the position of sheriff. Gilbert and Maggie talked about it for a long time, on the porch in the summer evenings after the children were in bed. Sheriff meant more responsibility, more visibility, more target. It also meant a better wage, which mattered with 3 children to support, and more authority to shape the kind of law enforcement that Gilbert believed in, which was more about peace than punishment. "Do you want it?" Maggie asked. "Yes," he said. "Then take it," she said. "It will be more complicated," he said. "There will be more, Gilbert," she said. "Do you trust me to manage what is mine to manage?" He looked at her. "Completely." "And I trust you to manage what is yours. Take the job." He was appointed sheriff of Sumner County in January of 1886, and Harrington shook his hand with the deep satisfaction of a man who has successfully completed a project he cares about, and said, "Do not let me down, Gil," and Gilbert said he would not, and he didn't. The years that followed were not without difficulty. They were human years, full of the ordinary complications of living together, and raising children and managing limited resources, and all the thousand small frictions that come from 2 strong-willed, intelligent people sharing a life. There were arguments, real ones, the kind that came from the clash of 2 people who each had clear convictions and were willing to defend them. They learned how to argue and how to stop arguing, and how to come back from an argument without either of them losing anything fundamental in the process. There was a winter in 1887 that was brutal, one of the hardest in Kansas memory, when the cold came in November and did not leave until April, and 3 of the cattle ranches outside town lost animals they could not afford to lose. And Gilbert spent most of those months riding out in weather that frightened Maggie with its severity, helping where he could, ensuring people were not dying quietly in isolated homesteads that no one had checked on. And Maggie kept the household running with the same methodical determination she brought to everything. And when he came home half frozen on those winter evenings, she had warm food and the stove lit and her arms around him within the first 30 seconds of his arrival, and in those moments the warmth of her felt like the most important thing in the world. In the spring of 1888, Maggie told him she was expecting again, and this time his response was different, not less joyful but more settled, the joy of a man who has done this before and knows what it means, what it requires, how completely it reorganizes everything. The second baby was a girl, born in October of 1888, with Maggie's dark hair and eyes and Gilbert's stubborn jaw, and they named her Ruth, for the kind woman in Wichita who had sent Maggie west in the first place, the woman whose misdirected advice had turned out to be the exact thing that needed to happen. Eli was 11 by the time Ruth was born, a serious, focused boy who was doing well in school and had decided, with the calm certainty of someone who has thought carefully about the available options, that he wanted to study law. Gilbert had responded to this with a quiet, private pride that he expressed by beginning to teach Eli, on Sunday afternoons, the practical realities of law as applied on the frontier, the gap between what statutes said and what justice required, the art of reading a situation before it became a crisis. Clara Mee was 9, and she was already the most socially sophisticated person in the household, the one who understood instinctively how every person in any room was feeling and what they needed, and who had opinions about everything and the articulateness to express them at considerable length. Thomas Gilbert Trask, who had been called Tommy from the beginning, was 3.5 and was essentially a small, cheerful catastrophe who treated the world as a series of things to climb, dismantle, and investigate, and who had his mother's intelligence and his father's single-minded focus applied to goals that were exclusively destructive. The closing months of 1889 brought something that neither Maggie nor Gilbert had been looking for, but both, in retrospect, understood had been inevitable. Eli, who was 12, came home from school one afternoon and told them, with the direct, unaffected honesty that had always been his primary characteristic, that the other boys had been saying things about his father, meaning Thomas, things about debt and failure, the same old story recycled through a new generation of schoolyard cruelty, and that he had not hit anyone this time, and that he needed to understand properly from both of them what was true. Gilbert and Maggie sat with him at the kitchen table that evening, after the younger children were in bed, and told him the truth, all of it, about Thomas's goodness and his struggle and the debt and Frank Culver and the flight from Missouri and the stagecoach with the broken axle and the empty plate and the mercantile steps and the moment that changed everything. Eli listened to all of it with his checkers player's concentration. When they were done, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "My father was a good man who worked hard and loved us and died before he could finish what he started." "Yes," Maggie said. Her voice was very steady. "And Gil found us," Eli said, using the name he had returned to in the last 2 years with the easy comfort of someone who has arrived at his own settled conclusion, "because he gave me his supper." "Yes," Gilbert said. Eli sat with this for another moment. Then he said, "That seems like the right place to start a story," and stood up and went to bed. Maggie looked at Gilbert across the table, and they were both quiet for a moment, and then she put her hand over his on the table, and he turned his hand over to hold hers, and they sat in the warm kitchen of their house in Caldwell, Kansas, in the autumn of 1889, and the story that had started with an empty plate and 2 hungry children was not ending. It was continuing, the way good stories do, by folding the end back into itself and becoming more. By the time the 1890s arrived, Caldwell was a different town than the one where Maggie had stepped off that broken-axled stagecoach 7 years earlier. The cattle trade was largely gone. The town had settled into a quieter shape, a farming community growing its way into the future, the violence and lawlessness of the Trail Drive era fading into the kind of stories that people told their children and their grandchildren with equal parts pride and relief. Gilbert was a well-respected sheriff, known throughout Sumner County for a particular brand of justice that was firm without being cruel, precise without being rigid. He had trained 2 deputies over the years, and both had gone on to positions of their own, which he took as a measure of something he was doing right. Maggie had moved beyond the piecework arrangement with Mrs. Perkins. By 1891, she had enough of a reputation in Caldwell and the surrounding county that she was doing custom work for clients who sought her out, a small but real business of her own, conducted from the front room of their house, which had been expanded by then to accommodate a family that had needed more space. The front room had a dedicated work area with a large window for light, and the sound of the treadle sewing machine was one of the sounds of the house, regular and rhythmic like breathing. Thomas, who was 6 by 1891, and had channeled his earlier enthusiasm for destructive investigation into a focused and ferocious curiosity about how mechanical things worked, had developed a particular attachment to the sewing machine, and had been caught on 2 separate occasions taking it apart to examine its workings. On the 3rd occasion Gilbert caught him at it. He sat down beside the boy and instead of stopping him said, "Show me how it goes back together." And Tommy showed him, perfectly, every piece in its correct place, and the machine worked afterward exactly as it had before. Gilbert had looked at his son and seen something there, a kind of mechanical intelligence that was going to need very specific room to grow. Ruth, at 3, was an entirely different personality from all of them, calm and observant in a way that was unusual in a child so small, with a quality of watchful patience that reminded Gilbert of himself in ways that moved him more than he could easily say. She was the child who sat quietly in the corner and watched everything and understood more than anyone had told her, and she had his eyes and his habit of stillness, and holding her was one of the uncomplicated joys of his life. In the spring of 1892, a letter arrived from Eli, who was 15 and had been attending a school in Wichita for the past year on a scholarship that he had won by examination, competing against boys from much more advantaged backgrounds and beating them in the straightforward way of someone who had never learned to be intimidated. The letter said that he was well and that the work was excellent, and that he intended to read law when the time came, and that he had met the district judge's clerk, who had told him something important about the history of property law in Kansas that he thought Gilbert would find interesting, and then provided 3 paragraphs of careful legal analysis that were, Gilbert told Maggie with genuine admiration, better than most adult legal writing he had encountered. Maggie read the letter twice, and then she folded it carefully and put it in the box where she kept the letters from Eli, and Gilbert watched her do it and saw on her face the particular expression that she wore for things that were too large for ordinary words, the look that was simultaneously pride and grief and love and the bittersweet recognition of a child becoming themselves. "Thomas would be so proud of him," she said quietly. "I am proud of him," Gilbert said simply. She looked at him. "So am I," she said. "Of all of them, a pause of us." He moved to where she was standing and put his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back against him, and they stood in the kitchen of their house in Caldwell in the afternoon light, the sounds of their younger children drifting in from the yard, and everything about the moment was ordinary and everything about it was irreplaceable. The summer of 1893 was the summer they went back to Missouri. It was Gilbert's idea, which surprised Maggie when he proposed it. He had been doing some research quietly, through a contact of Harrington's who had remained in touch with legal matters in the county where Thomas Ramsey's farm had been, and he had discovered that Frank Culver had never filed any legitimate claim against the estate, which meant that the farm, such as it was, had technically remained in the ownership of Thomas's heirs, which is to say in Maggie's, and by extension the children's names, all this time. The farm had been worked by a neighboring family for several years, which was a kind of informal use arrangement that was common enough on the frontier, and Maggie had not pursued it because she had not known she had anything to pursue. But the legal reality was that she had a claim, and Gilbert had helped her work through the paperwork with a Wichita attorney, and the outcome was a small settlement from the neighboring family who had been working the land, enough to matter but not enough to be transformative. More important than the money was the trip itself. Maggie had not been back to Missouri since she had left in the pre-dawn dark with 2 children and everything she could carry. She had left something there beyond the farm, some piece of herself, some unfinished conversation with the life she had lived and the man she had loved there. They went in July, the whole family on the train as far as the railroad went, and then by hired wagon for the last 30 miles. The farm was smaller than Maggie remembered, which was not surprising, because grief tends to make things larger in memory. The house was still standing, occupied by the neighboring family who had been using the land, a decent family who received the Trasks with hospitality and a certain amount of relieved guilt. They went to the churchyard where Thomas was buried, Maggie and Gilbert and the children, on a warm July afternoon with the Missouri summer full around them. There was a plain stone marker, weathered but legible. Maggie stood at the grave for a long time. Gilbert stood beside her, not touching her, giving her the privacy of the moment while being absolutely present within it. The children were quiet in the way children are when they understand without being told that something important is happening. Maggie said quietly to the stone and to the summer air, and to whatever had endured of the man who had been good and steady and gone too soon, that they were all right. That the children were well, that Eli was going to be a lawyer, that Clara Mee was going to run the world, that Tommy was going to take something apart and put it back together better than it was before, that Ruth was watching everything and understanding all of it, that she, Maggie, was all right, genuinely all right, which she was. She said that she had not forgotten him and would not forget him. That she had loved him truly and that the love was still there, changed but present, the scar instead of the wound. She turned to Gilbert and she put her hand in his, and he closed his fingers around hers, and they walked back to the wagon together. On the train ride home to Kansas, with the children sleeping around them in the late evening, Maggie put her head against Gilbert's shoulder and he put his arm around her and they watched the Missouri countryside darken outside the window. "Thank you for taking us," she said. "Thank you for letting me be there," he said. They were quiet for a while. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me." "I used to be afraid in the early days that you would feel like second best," she said. "That the past would make it seem like less." A pause. "I want you to know that it is not less. It is different. It is its own entire thing, what we have. It does not diminish anything that came before, and nothing that came before diminishes it. I have never known how to say that well enough." He was quiet for a moment. "You just said it well enough," he said. She pressed closer to him in the warm train car, and he held her, and outside the window the dark country moved past, and in front of them, back in Caldwell, their house was waiting with the light in the window that Clara Mee had insisted on leaving burning. The years after that moved with the particular quality that happy years have, full and fast and detailed, rich with the ordinary specificity of a life being lived completely. Eli came back from Wichita in the fall of 1894 to read law under a new attorney in Caldwell named Hendricks, who had taken a position with the county. He was 17 and had grown into a young man of striking composure and intelligence, tall like his father Thomas, and with Maggie's eyes and the particular quality of judgment that Gilbert recognized as something you could not teach, only develop, and which Eli had been developing his whole life. He was not a stranger to his family. He had been home for every holiday, and the family had visited him in Wichita twice a year. But there was a particular, visible quality to the reunion that moved Gilbert deeply, watching Maggie hold her eldest son, watching Eli hug his siblings, watching the family fit back together with all its additions and developments, and the simple, unalterable fact of its love. Eli shook Gilbert's hand and then, after a fractional pause that was almost imperceptible, embraced him instead, and Gilbert held the boy who had been 6 years old on the mercantile steps and was now 17 and taller than him and going to be a lawyer. And the circle of it, the full, completed circle of it, was something he did not have words for and did not need them. By 1896, the household on the east side of Caldwell was a busy, lively, occasionally chaotic place that was the most alive location in Gilbert Trask's experience of the world. Tommy was 11 and had found a mentor in a machinist who had set up shop in town, and he spent his afternoons there learning the precise, physical language of mechanisms and gears, coming home with grease on his hands and the focused glow of someone who has found his thing. Clara Mee was 16 and was, as predicted, managing everything and everyone within her considerable orbit, with a grace and authority that made grown adults follow her suggestions without quite realizing they had been directed. Ruth was 8 and was reading at a level that impressed her teacher considerably, working her way through the small but carefully selected collection of books that occupied one wall of the front room. Gilbert was 42 years old and in full health and entirely happy in a way that was so fundamental and complete that it had ceased to feel remarkable and had become simply the texture of his life. The way the air had a texture, the way the familiar weight of his badge had a texture, the way Maggie's voice had a texture in the morning before the children were awake, soft and low and directed only at him. He had been sheriff for 10 years. He was good at it in ways that he understood better now than he had at the beginning, the ways that the job required not just law but wisdom, not just authority but judgment, the ability to see a situation whole and respond to what it actually was rather than what it appeared to be. He had made mistakes. He had corrected them when he could. He had tried to be as honest about the failures as he was about the successes, which was the standard he held everyone else to and therefore had to hold himself to as well. In the winter of 1897, Harrington died. He had been in good health and then, very suddenly, he was not, and he was gone within 3 weeks of the first symptom, and his wife, who had been asking him to retire for years and had had him to herself for less than 2 years before the end, received the news with a grief that Gilbert recognized as the grief of someone who had loved truly and lost completely. He attended the funeral with Maggie beside him and the children around them, and he stood at the graveside of the man who had trusted him when he was young and needed it, and had recommended him for a job that had become the shape of his life, and he felt the loss as the specific, clean grief of a good man's absence. Afterward, at the gathering at Harrington's house, Mrs. Harrington took Gilbert's hands in both of hers and told him that Cole had been proud of him, that he had talked about it often in the last years, the way things had turned out, the way Gilbert had grown into the job and the life. She looked at Maggie and said that Cole had told her, not long after Maggie had arrived in Caldwell, that a woman like that would be exactly what Gilbert needed, and that he had been very pleased with himself about how it turned out. Maggie laughed, genuinely, and said that Sheriff Harrington had been a perceptive man, and Mrs. Harrington said that he had been insufferably perceptive and that she had told him so regularly. And for a moment the grief lightened into something that felt more like gratitude, the gratitude of people who had known something good and were honoring it by remembering it clearly. In the spring of 1899, Eli passed the bar examination and became a lawyer at the age of 22, the youngest in the county and one of the youngest in the state. He came home for the occasion with a quiet, deeply satisfied expression that was the Eli version of exuberance. And the celebration Maggie organized was, in the tradition of celebrations organized by Maggie, precisely right, full of food and people who mattered and no wasted space. At the table that evening, with all 4 children and the 2 adults who had become the center of their particular universe, Gilbert looked around at the faces he loved most in the world and felt the complete, specific, irreducible weight of everything that had accumulated since an August evening in 1883, when he had walked across the street with a plate of food he intended to eat himself. He had given up his supper. It was the smallest possible act, a plate of salt pork and potatoes and gravy, going cold in the evening air. He had given it to a boy with his arm around his sister and a girl with silent tears and balled fists, and in doing so he had begun a series of events that had given him the entire content of his life. He thought about what it meant, that the whole architecture of a person's happiness could hang on a single moment of ordinary, unconsidered kindness. That a decision made in a second, without any calculation, had turned out to be the most important thing he had ever done. Not the difficult decisions, not the dangerous ones, not the ones that required courage or expertise. A plate of food, offered without hesitation to children who needed it. Maggie caught him looking around the table and raised her eyebrows in the small, private, intimate way she did when she was asking him something without words. He shook his head slightly, meaning it was nothing, meaning it was everything, meaning that he did not have language for it, but she already knew it anyway, as she always did with her direct dark eyes and her precise, honest heart. She smiled at him across the table, the full smile, the one that had stopped the air in his chest on a porch in September of 1883 and still did, 15 years later, and he smiled back in the quiet, unguarded way of a man who is completely, irrevocably, irreversibly home. Eli stood up at the end of the meal and proposed a toast, with the careful, slightly formal eloquence of a newly minted lawyer who was also a beloved son, and who knew exactly what he was toasting to his family, to his mother's strength and his father's kindness, and the evening on the mercantile steps that had started everything, to Thomas Ramsey, who had been good, and to Gilbert Trask, who had continued the goodness, to Clara Mee, who managed everything, to Tommy, who fixed everything, to Ruth, who understood everything, to the simple and enormous truth that they were here, all of them, and that this was enough and more than enough and everything. They drank the toast in the lamplight of the kitchen in Caldwell, Kansas, at the end of the 19th century. This family that had been built from loss and hunger and ordinary kindness and stubborn love. And outside the window the town that had made them was quieter than it had been, but still alive, still continuing, still finding its shape in the changing country. Gilbert washed the dishes that night, while Maggie sat at the kitchen table going over the accounts for her dressmaking business, which had grown in the last year to the point where she was considering taking on her own apprentice. And Clara Mee was reading in the front room, and Tommy was somewhere at the back of the house making a noise that suggested the successful disassembly of something, and Ruth was asleep in her room with her book still open on the pillow beside her. And Eli was sitting on the porch in the cool spring night, thinking the thoughts of a young man who has just become what he intended to become. It was a Thursday evening in April, and nothing remarkable happened in it, and it was one of the best evenings of Gilbert Trask's life. He dried the last dish and put it away and leaned against the counter and looked at his wife, who was bent over her accounts with the focused expression she wore when the numbers required her full attention, her hair pinned up in its characteristic slightly escaping way, the ring on her finger catching the lamplight. She felt him looking and glanced up. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I was just thinking about supper." She put down her pen and gave him the look, the direct, reading look. "You are thinking about that first night," she said. "The plate." "I think about it sometimes," he said. "So do I," she said. "Often." A pause. "It was the most important supper you ever gave away." "Yes," he said, "it was." She held out her hand across the table, and he crossed the kitchen and took it, and she looked up at him with those dark, honest eyes that had always seen him clearly from the very first moment. "Come sit with me," she said. He sat down beside her at the kitchen table in the lamplight, in the house full of their children, in the town where they had found each other, in the life they had made from the simplest possible beginning. An empty plate and a hungry boy, and a mother standing in a doorway with the last of her pride still intact. the whole, entire, abundant rest of it.